Coming up in the Canberra News at 7, after 2 years in the black, the ACT budget will move back into deficit. Despite that, the Territory Government is still talking up its future spending on community services. For ratepayers, the pain will continue, with bills rising by between $100 and $200 over the next 12 months. But eligible first home buyers won't pay any stamp duty from July. I'm Dan Bourchier. Join me at 7. Tonight, the ACT budget plunges into deficit as ratepayers continue to feel the pain. Fears personal details of up to 200,000 ANU staff and students may have been accessed in a data breach. The RBA cuts interest rates for the first time in almost 3 years, but will the banks follow? And protests expected as Donald Trump's visit to the UK continues. Good evening, Dan Bourchier with ABC News. We're coming to you live tonight from the floor of the Legislative Assembly chamber in Civic, where earlier today the Chief Minister Andrew Barr handed down his 8th budget. A budget that sees the ACT head into deficit for the next 2 years. Tonight we'll have a good look at what's in it for you and how your local community has fared. First, here's a quick snapshot. For ratepayers, it's bad news again. Rates for homes and units will continue to rise. Other fees and charges are also increasing in line with wages. But on the other side of the ledger, stamp duty is going down. And as previously announced, there's extra money for health and for education. Now, to crunch the numbers in more detail, ACT political reporter Elise Scott begins our coverage.
It's a budget that slides into the red and offers few sweeteners for the taxpayers bearing the load, just in time for voters to head to the polls next October.
And Elise Scott joins me now. Elise, this seems a brave strategy to go into a deficit in an election year.
Yeah, Dan, it's never great news going into an election year in deficit, especially when ratepayers are really feeling the pinch. They'll have to trust that the government knows what it's doing economically of those big ticket items in the lead up to the October poll.
ACT political reporter Elise Scott there. So that's the big picture. Now let's have a look at what happened for your community. Georgia Hitch is with us. Georgia, let's start in Canberra's north.
Dan, in the north, we already know most of the funding for new schools will be in Gungahlin. Calvary Hospital emergency and surgery services will be expanded, and a new nurse-led walk-in centre is planned for Dixon. Taking a closer look at Gungahlin, there's $20 million over the next 4 years for the home of football in Throsby, which will include new playing fields, futsal courts and amenities. $2.5 million has been set aside for a new park and ride facility at Wells Station. There'll be more car parks at Palmerston Shops and a new nature play park at Yerraby Pond. Moving over to Belconnen, the big ticket is over $44 million to upgrade the main arterial road between Belconnen and Gungahlin. There'll be more spaces at Hawker Primary School and new shops to be developed in Fraser. Now finally, looking at the inner north, $16.6 million has been set aside over the next 4 years for upgrades to Hague Park, Dixon and Braddon, and the revitalisation of the Melbourne and Sydney buildings. There'll also be more spaces for students at Lynham High School and upgrades to the Ainslie and Gorman Arts Centres. But how do these announcements fare with what people were hoping to see? Here's a snapshot of some of the priorities for people in Canberra's north.
We live in communities and we need infrastructure in our communities.
So Georgia, that's the north. What about the other side of the lake?
Dan, in the south, the government is spending big on upgrading and expanding the Canberra Hospital and getting Woden Interchange ready for the future arrival of light rail. Taking a closer look at the inner south, one thing the Chief Minister mentioned in his speech today is the new Kingston Arts Precinct. We don't have any details, though, about how much money is going towards it just yet. There's also $1.5 million to upgrade 4 dog parks and local ovals, including in Narrabundah and Yarralumla, and $800,000 will be going to upgrade the Manuka Pool. In Woden and Western Creek, there's also $500,000 to revitalise the Woden Library, $1.75 million for a new Woden Community Centre, and also money for more car parks at Coolaman Court. Finally to Tuggeranong, and it seems the further south you go, the more difficult it is to see where the major budget spends are on community projects or services. The biggest spend is $3 million on upgrading Lanyon Homestead, which is south of Banks. There's also money to upgrade the Tuggeranong Community Centre, and Canberra will be getting a new nature playground. We spoke to people in South Canberra today. This is what they make of the budget.
They've built a rail to the north, but the south there's nothing done.
So there you go, Dan. Seems people in the south feeling a little forgotten by the government in this year's budget.
Georgia Hitch reporting there, and we'll have more community reaction on ABC Radio Canberra Breakfast tomorrow morning. Now to the government's perspective, and the Chief Minister Andrew Barr joined me earlier. Chief Minister, good evening.
Evening, Dan.
We're already seeing the sell happening for the budget, Canberrans starting to see what it means for them. Already we're hearing that those living in the south feel as though they've been left out of this budget. What do you say to them?
Well, the single biggest road infrastructure project in the budget is the duplication of the Monero Highway, which is a project delivered in partnership with the Australian government.
Chief Minister, thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Now to the rest of today's news. For the second time in a year, the Australian National University has fallen victim to a massive cyber attack. Personal details of around 200,000 past and present students have been accessed in a sophisticated raid that went undetected for months. National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
2019 is going to be a great year. I encourage you to immerse yourself.
Little did the ANU's Vice-Chancellor know that by the start of 2019, someone had already dived deeply into almost every aspect of electronic student records. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
Police have raided the Canberra home of a journalist who reported a federal government plan to give spy agencies greater domestic surveillance powers. News Corporation has condemned the Australian Federal Police raid of the home of its political reporter Annika Smethurst as a dangerous act of intimidation. Using leaked top-secret documents, Smethurst last year reported on a government bid to extend the ability of cyber spy agency, the Australian Signals Directorate, to collect information on Australians.
It's an independent investigation, as you would expect, and the AFP will have their reasons for the sequencing of their investigation.
It was 30 years ago today that the Chinese military entered Tiananmen Square and broke up student protesters with force, killing hundreds or even thousands of people. Ever since, the ruling Communist Party has tried to keep the younger generation in the dark about what happened in 1989. The censorship appears to have worked. As China correspondent Bill Birtles discovered in Beijing, most of today's students won't talk about the massacre or have ever heard of it.
In Tiananmen Square, business as usual, with no sign of the anniversary.
Bill Birtles, ABC News, near Tiananmen Square, Beijing.
One of London's largest protests against a foreign leader is taking shape tonight, led by a much younger version of Donald Trump. The Greater London Authority granted permission for a giant orange baby Trump blimp to be inflated in Westminster's Parliament Square. The protest comes after a day marked by pomp and pageantry for Mr Trump, who earlier met the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Here's Europe correspondent Samantha Hawley.
It was a welcome fit for royalty.
To finance now, and the interest rate cut boosted the Australian share market, erasing early losses. But the dollar held its ground ahead of an important speech this evening by the Reserve Bank Governor. Here's Phillip, Lasker.
The National Australia Bank called it one of the most telegraphed moves in history. And that's why the Australian dollar hasn't weakened. The market built in 2 rate cuts. We have one of them, but there was no firm indication of a second. At least that's the theory. And that's finance.
To the weather now, and tonight's photo comes from Paul Bainton. A stunning view across Lake Burley-Griffin towards the Carillion. Thanks for that one, Paul. A chilly start to the morning, but not as cold as it has been on some days this week. An overnight low of 4 before a blustery top of 11 degrees with plenty of wind today. A similar story around the region, but a little bit warmer on the coast. 15 in Moruya and 13 degrees in Bega. It was 13 in Wagga Wagga. Interstate and cool and wet on the east coast, 14 in Sydney, 13 in Melbourne, 22 for Perth and a pleasant 26 in Darwin. On the satellite there's a low off the New South Wales coast which is producing showers and a few storms. It was mostly clear across the rest of the country. Those clear and calm conditions across South Australia and Victoria are due to a high pressure system lurking over the Great Australian Bight. Tomorrow, and it'll be another wet and windy day across the eastern states. Sydney 17, 14 in Melbourne, while Perth will reach 23. Closer to home, and it's shaping up as a wet day on the coast. Nowra 16 and 17 in Batemans Bay. Colder but dry further inland. Yass has a forecast top of 13 and 12 in Goulburn. Here in Canberra, it'll be another cold start with patches of morning frost before a sunny day, an overnight low of 1 and a high of 14 degrees. The sun will rise at 1 minute past 7 and set at 3 minutes past 5. Looking ahead, another cold snap will arrive as the week draws to a close. Overnight temperatures will be well below zero heading into the weekend. And that's all from the Assembly on the ACT Budget Day. I'm Dan Bourchier. Good night.